California's coastline moves 6 feet higher overnight. Not gradually, not over centuries. In less than 12 hours, container ships worth $500 million are stranded on exposed mud. Tide pools that sheltered life for thousands of years now bake in the sun, unreachable by the ocean. And every GPS station from San Francisco to San Diego is screaming the same impossible message. The ground moved when it shouldn't have been able to. Scientists at NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory ran the numbers 3 times, recalibrated their instruments, and got identical results. The United States Geological Survey cross-checked with satellite data, tide gauges, and ground sensors. Everything confirmed what shouldn't exist. But wait, this gets genuinely terrifying. The land is still rising, and no one can explain why. For decades, the rhythm of California's coast was predictable. Almost boring if you're a geophysicist who measures ground movement for a living. The Pacific and North American plates meet along this coastline, grinding past each other at speeds you could time with a calendar. Most sections creep upward or sink at rates between 0 and 4 millimeters per year. That's less than the thickness of 2 stacked credit cards. Annually, Maureen Gavorchan, a remote sensing scientist at JPL, spent 15 years tracking these microscopic shifts. Her instruments could detect vertical movement smaller than a fingernail's thickness. In the Santa Barbara Basin, the most dramatic uplift she'd ever documented was 3 millimeters in a full year. 3 millimeters. Scientists built entire careers studying variations of a few millimeters. That was the universe they understood. The monitoring network they trusted was absurdly precise. Ground-based GPS stations anchored in concrete monuments. Satellite radar systems that bounce signals off the same spots twice a week. Tide gauges measuring sea level relative to land with 19th century reliability, backed by 21st century digital logging. Every data point checked against every other data point. Redundancy wasn't a safety feature, it was the entire system. If the ground moved even a centimeter unexpectedly, alarms would trigger across multiple agencies. So when the alarms started screaming on a Tuesday morning in October, the first assumption was simple. The instruments had failed, they hadn't. 3:17 a.m. Pacific time, a GPS station near Malibu registered a vertical displacement of 1.8 meters, 6 feet. The software flagged it as a sensor malfunction and automatically discarded the reading. Standard protocol. These stations occasionally glitch from power surges, antenna issues, or atmospheric interference. But then Santa Barbara reported the same anomaly. 6 minutes later, Long Beach, then Monterey, then San Luis Obispo, then stations that had never malfunctioned in 20 years of operation. By 4 a.m., 87 GPS stations along 400 miles of coastline were reporting identical, impossible readings. The overnight analyst at JPL's monitoring center made the call that would change everything. He disabled the automatic error filters and let the raw data through. Every station confirmed the same story. The California coast had jumped vertically during the night. And wait, it gets strange. Seismometers scattered across the state recorded nothing. Not a single tremor. The seismic network that had successfully detected earthquakes, magnitude 2.0 and above for decades, showed a perfectly flat line throughout the night. Whatever moved the coastline did it silently. By 6 a.m., emergency protocols kicked in. Geologists scrambled from their homes. NASA scientists at JPL initiated full system diagnostics. The USGS activated their rapid response team. Harbor masters in Los Angeles and Long Beach were making calls they'd rehearsed for earthquakes and tsunamis, but never for this. The container terminals at America's busiest port complex sat exposed above the receding waterline. Ships that had docked the previous evening were grounded on mud that should have been 6 feet underwater. Port of Los Angeles handles $1.4 billion in trade daily. It went to zero in a single night. Insurance companies received claims they had no policy language to cover. Supply chain managers stared at tracking systems showing cargo that physically couldn't move fresh produce from Asia, destined for American grocery stores, sat in refrigerated containers on ships that couldn't reach land. But wait, this gets worse. While economists calculated financial losses, marine biologists were witnessing something more immediate, something irreversible. The intertidal zone, that narrow band where land meets sea, is one of the most densely populated ecosystems on the planet. Tide pools carved into coastal rock shelter anemones, starfish, crabs, urchins, mussels. Creatures that evolved over millions of years to survive the rhythm of tides. The rhythm just broke. Biologists from Monterey Bay Aquarium reached the shore at dawn and found tide pools that should have been refreshed by the incoming tide sitting 6 feet above the waterline. Exposed, heating in the October sun. They organized rescue teams within an hour. Volunteers with buckets, wet towels, anything that could transport water and living creatures down to the new shoreline. But the scale overwhelmed them instantly. Every beach along 400 miles of coast, every tide pool, every creature adapted to a world that no longer existed. Seals and sea lions, hauled out on rocks they'd used for generations, found themselves stranded on what had become inland cliffs. Seabirds that nested in coastal caves arrived to find their nesting sites, unreachable kelp forests, those underwater cathedrals of life, suddenly found their upper canopies exposed to air and sunlight that would kill them within hours. The ecological cascade was terrible, and no one could stop it. Engineers at JPL approached this the way they approach every impossible reading: assume equipment failure until proven otherwise. They pulled the Rhinex files, the raw GPS data that underlies every position calculation. Each file was cross-referenced against station maintenance logs, antenna specifications, even the soil composition beneath the concrete monuments. Looking for anything that could create a false 6-foot reading. Atmospheric interference. The team ran tropospheric and ionospheric corrections. Even the worst atmospheric conditions might introduce a few centimeters of error, not meters. Reference frame error? They checked the International Terrestrial Reference Frame, the global coordinate system that GPS relies on. If that system had somehow shifted, it might create the illusion of vertical movement. The reference frame was rock solid. Multipath distortion came next. GPS signals bouncing off buildings or water can confuse receivers. But these stations were positioned specifically to minimize multipath, on open bluffs, away from reflective surfaces. The multipath logs were clean, then they checked INSAR. This is independent satellite data that measures ground deformation by comparing radar signals from multiple passes. If the GPS network had failed systematically, INSAR would show no corresponding movement. INSAR confirmed the uplift. By noon, the team had eliminated every known error source. The usual suspects that cause false readings in GPS networks? None of them fit. But this is what made everyone freeze. Tide gauges, the old-school mechanical sensors that have measured sea level for over a century, reported something consistent with the GPS readings. The relative height difference between land and sea had changed exactly as the GPS stations indicated. Independent confirmation from 19th century technology. 3 separate measurement systems: GPS satellites, radar interferometry, mechanical tide gauges, built on completely different principles, maintained by different agencies, subject to different error modes. All 3 told the same impossible story. During all this, a geologist at the California Geological Survey was searching historical records, looking for anything, any precedent that might explain sudden coastal uplift. She found Portuguese Bend. In 1956, a section of coastal bluff in Portuguese Bend, south of Los Angeles, began moving. Residents noticed cracks in driveways. Roads developed bumps overnight. Within 7 months, the ground had shifted 22 feet, 140 homes destroyed. But that was horizontal movement, a landslide creeping toward the ocean. And it took 7 months, not 12 hours. Still, Portuguese Bend never stopped moving. The ancient landslide, triggered by road construction that disrupted drainage, continued for decades at rates of barely an inch per week, until 2023. That winter, atmospheric rivers pummeled California with rainfall exceeding 200% of normal. The water didn't just saturate the surface. It penetrated deep into the clay layers that underlie the hills, lubricating fault plains that had been stable for years. The landslide accelerated to 30 centimeters per week, 10 times its historical average. Sensors detected something unexpected. As the massive block of land slid toward the ocean, its leading edge compressed against more resistant bedrock near the coast. The result was uplift at the toe of the landslide. The ground, unable to move forward, bulged upward. Geologists call this toe uplift. It's documented at landslides globally, usually at rates of a few millimeters to centimeters per year, not feet per day. And certainly not along 400 miles of coastline simultaneously, but it sort of established something critical. Rapid vertical uplift without earthquakes was physically possible. Just not at this scale, not this fast, not everywhere at once. The Portuguese BEN data gave scientists a mechanism, but it didn't explain the event. It was like finding a book about matches after your entire city burned down overnight. Technically relevant, completely insufficient. Within 48 hours, the data reached the private sector. GeoStride, a Silicon Valley satellite analytics firm with contracts from oil companies and real estate developers, released their own analysis. Their algorithms, trained on years of satellite data, confirmed the 6-foot vertical displacement with even higher precision than government networks. The USGS responded within hours. A public statement, carefully worded but unmistakably aggressive. They questioned GeoStride's methodology, suggested their satellite-only approach was vulnerable to systematic bias, implied their commercial interests might influence their interpretations. GeoStride fired back on Twitter within an hour. The public fight escalated fast. Leaked emails showed USGS scientists privately questioning whether their own ground sensors had been properly maintained. GeoStride analysts accused government agencies of downplaying the severity to avoid triggering evacuation orders they couldn't afford. News outlets feasted on the controversy, running headings like, "Who owns the truth about California's coast? When ground sensors disagree with satellites, who do you trust?" But here's what got buried in the noise. Behind closed doors, both teams were seeing the same data. The disagreement wasn't about whether the uplift happened. It was actually about what to do with information that broke every model they had. Evacuate millions of people based on readings that shouldn't be possible? Or wait for more evidence while the land potentially keeps rising? Insurance companies weren't waiting. Policies covering earthquake damage or tsunami events had clear language. This event fit neither category. Claims were denied by the thousands. Code, unexplained geological anomaly, not covered. A team at Caltech's Seismological Laboratory ran simulations for 3 days straight. They input the uplift data, the seismic silence, the geographic distribution. Let their computer models search for any tectonic mechanism that could produce these results. The models failed consistently. Standard earthquake mechanics? Requires seismic waves. There were none. Volcanic intrusion would show thermal anomalies and ground swelling over weeks. This happened overnight with no thermal signature. Magmatic dike emplacement produces continuous ground deformation, not sudden discrete jumps. They tried exotic scenarios, slow slip events on deep faults, detachment surfaces suddenly unlocking. Even rapid fluid injection from deep crustal sources? Nothing fit. But wait, there's a third option no one wanted to say out loud. What if the monitoring systems and the physics are both fine? What if something happened that simply doesn't fit in our current framework of how the Earth works? A junior researcher at UC Berkeley, analyzing ground deformation patterns, noticed something strange in the spatial distribution. The uplift wasn't uniform. It showed a coherent wave-like pattern, subtle but measurable, propagating from south to north over the course of the night. As if something was moving beneath the coast. She ran the numbers and found a propagation velocity of approximately 30 kilometers per hour. Too fast for known tectonic processes. Too slow for seismic waves, sitting in an uncomfortable middle ground that matched nothing in the geophysics textbooks. Her advisor told her to keep the analysis out of her thesis until they understood it better. While scientists debated mechanisms, a historian at Stanford was searching geological archives for anything comparable. Pre-instrumental records, indigenous oral histories, anything that might suggest California's coast had done this before. She found fragments, oral traditions from Chumash and Olón peoples describing times when the land stood up from the sea. Spanish colonial records from the 1700s mentioning unexplained changes in coastal topography that made harbor charts suddenly inaccurate. But nothing at this scale. The most intriguing record came from 1812. A massive earthquake, estimated magnitude 7.5, struck near Santa Barbara. Contemporary accounts describe dramatic uplift of the coastline in some areas, with tide pools and reefs suddenly exposed above the waterline. But that was immediately after a major earthquake. It was obvious, witnessed, documented. This time the seismometers were silent. If the geological record contained events like this, they occurred so rarely that written history hadn't captured them with sufficient detail, and instrumental monitoring had only existed for a few decades. What if California's coast had memory? A tendency to move in ways that repeated on timescales longer than human observation. Months after the initial uplift, monitoring continues. The data isn't public. Access is restricted to government agencies and select research institutions. But scientists talk, leaks happen, multiple sources confirm the coastline has continued to rise. Not at the dramatic rate of that first night, but measurably, an additional 8 to 12 centimeters in few months, distributed unevenly along the affected zone. That might sound big after a 6-foot jump. It's not, because continued movement means whatever caused the initial event is still active, still happening, still completely unexplained. Internal USGS memos, obtained through Freedom of Information requests, reveal contingency planning for evacuation scenarios that include continued acceleration of vertical displacement. Translation: they're preparing for the possibility that this could get worse, much worse. A confidential report from a civil engineering firm assessed 200 buildings in downtown Los Angeles. Their conclusion: 34% showed stress fractures consistent with sudden foundation displacement. Most weren't immediately dangerous, but the long-term structural integrity was uncertain. No public announcement was made. The reasoning, according to leaked internal discussions: avoid panic that could trigger mass evacuations without clear evidence of immediate danger. How many lives are you willing to risk by not evacuating versus the chaos and potential casualties from evacuating millions? The answer appears to be wait and monitor. We know California's emergency management system is built around known threats: earthquakes, wildfires, floods. Each has protocols, warning systems, evacuation routes. This event broke the playbook. How do you evacuate for a threat that already happened but might happen again? Where do you tell people to go? Inland areas that might experience their own uplift? Other states? And for how long? Moving 3 million people, even temporarily, would cost billions. Housing them, feeding them, maintaining emergency services. And if the threat doesn't materialize, who pays for the false alarm? Increased sensor density along the coast. Satellite passes doubled. Ground-penetrating radar surveys running continuously. But no public alarm, no evacuation orders, no disruption to the largest economy in the United States. Life continues with instruments watching for the next impossible event. Schools stay open. Businesses operate. The ports, after frantic dredging operations and modified shipping procedures, return to partial operation. Everything looks normal if you don't read the restricted data. The laboratories still don't have answers, and the working theories remain unsatisfying. Maybe a slow slip event on a deep fault interface triggered sympathetic movement across multiple segments simultaneously. But slow slip events have never produced this kind of rapid surface displacement. Maybe fluid injection from deep crustal sources, possibly related to plate boundary processes scientists don't fully understand. But that would require fluid volumes that seem physically implausible. Maybe the monitoring networks did experience a coordinated failure more sophisticated than current error checking can detect. But that requires believing in coincidences that strain probability. Or maybe Earth's coastal dynamics operate with mechanisms science hasn't discovered yet. Not because scientists are incompetent. Oh no. But because instrumental monitoring represents a tiny window of observation compared to geological time. We've watched California's coast with modern instruments for barely 50 years. The coastline has existed for millions. What we call unprecedented might just be rare enough that recorded history hasn't caught it before. It's been months since that night. The tide pools that died haven't recovered. New species are colonizing the altered coastline. But the ecosystems that existed for thousands of years are gone. The economic losses topped $20 billion before accountants stopped updating the estimates. And the ground is still moving. Millimeters per month now, but consistently upward in several areas. Scientists watch their instruments with the kind of focused attention you reserve for something you don't understand but can't ignore. Because mountains, coastlines, and tectonic plates operate on timescales that make human monitoring seem like brief glances. They were here long before civilization. They'll be here long after. And when they move in ways that break our models, our instruments, and our understanding, we're forced to admit how little we actually know. So what do you think is happening beneath California? Is this a natural process we simply haven't documented before? Or is something fundamentally changing in the way our planet's crust behaves? Drop your theory in the comments. Because honestly, we're all trying to figure this out together. Subscribe for more mysteries that challenge what we think we know about our planet. And check out the next video here.